Hello everyone and welcome to another ET118 lecture. This week we're going to be discussing consonants, so the classification of consonants. Specifically, we're going to discuss what the distinction is between consonants and vowels. And then we're going to discuss articulation of consonants, that is how they're made in the mouth. So the place where they're made, the manner, how they're made, and the question of voicing, so whether there is vibration of the vocal cords. Talk about articulation, and we'll also mention some variation. So to get straight to it, what is the difference between vowels and consonants? Well, there is a clear difference, and that is that consonants involve an obstruction to the airflow. So at some point there is an obstruction made by the articulators between the larynx and the lips. So if we try to say bin, if we try to say sad, and if we try to say church, concentrate on the initial consonants. So b, s, ch. I think you can hear that b has an obstruction. And as you're making the sound, I hope you can hear that you're doing that by closing. Your lips are closed when you start to articulate the sound and then you open them. It's a little bit more complicated in the case of s. So we seem to have pushed our tongue up to the front of the alveolar ridge, s, sad, and it's a kind of hissing sound. And it's even more complicated really when we come to ch, so the phoneme ch, because we've got a kind of stop sound. And if you take the two bits of the affricate apart, you've got t, sh, sh. So we get sh. But you can hear again, first of all, we've got some kind of stop. We've pushed the tongue right up to the alveolar ridge. Then we broaden the tongue out a little bit, but we're still obstructing the airway. So you get this hissing sound. There's some air coming out, but it's hissing. Vowels, on the other hand, have no such obstruction. So the tongue may come close to the palate, but it doesn't obstruct the airflow. It might direct it in different ways, but it doesn't stop it leaving your mouth. If we this time try those three words and we just isolate the vowels, we end up with I, a, and for me, okay? I'm a non-rhotic speaker. Some of you may have church, in which case you've got an extra consonant, but concentrate on the vowel and it's something like okay? It's a centralized vowel. So we've got I, a, I, a, I, a. That's embarrassing now, so I'll just stop doing this. You pause the video and say it to yourself. Try and work out where the tongue is directing the sound, and you'll hear that one of them is sort of more front in the mouth and higher. One of them is lower, the tongue's going lower down, and one of them sort of in the middle, as if you were saying, I don't know what the time is. So I, high front, a, low at the front, and in the middle. Your tongue is relaxed. It's not really doing very much at all. But the airflow is leaving the mouth. It's directed by the tongue, but at no point is the tongue stopping it, obstructing it. In contrast then, when we articulate consonants, we get a narrowing of the vocal tract, or we get a complete closure. So if we go back to our friend sh, we'd managed to narrow the mouth down. We'd squashed up, bunched up the tongue. And in the case of b, we actually began with a complete closure, so the lips had completely closed off the vocal tract, and then the sound burst out. And there are three dimensions of consonant articulation that we just need to keep coming back to. So voicing, the question of whether the vocal folds are vibrating a lot or not very much at all. Place of articulation, where we are making the sound in the mouth. And manner, how we are obstructing the airflow. So we talk about VPM labels for consonants, and by the end of this lecture you will be getting very good at applying VPM labels to the consonants of English. Voice, place, manner, and that is how consonants are described. So if we look at p, we would call p a voiceless bilabial plosive. Let's think about then a voiceless bilabial plosive. So it's voiceless. If we think about b, so say b and now say p. And if you can, so put your hand on your Adam's apple, or the place where you would have an Adam's apple if you had one, and say b and p, b, p. And you will hear that b is a buzzier sort of sound. B is a kind of, it's making more vibrations there. And that's because the vocal folds are vibrating. It's voiced. In contrast, p is voiceless. They're both bilabials, so we make them, both b and p, we make them by closing our lips and then opening them suddenly. And they're plosives, the kind of sound that they are, the manner is plosive, a sort of explosion of sound. We've got a closure and then we suddenly open it and outburst the sound. So let's just go on and think about some more places of articulation. Okay, we've got, that's where the sound is made. And they usually involve one active articulator and one passive. So remember that active articulators are parts of the tongue. Okay. And if they are, it's common to just mention the passive articulator in the description. What do I mean by that? Okay, well, sometimes you'll hear about dental sounds. Well, dentals, your teeth don't move. Your teeth can't move, right? So we tend to mention the passive articulator as the place where something is made. If we think about something like duh, duh, okay, duh, it's an alveolar dental. Say duh. In English at least, my tongue is just behind my teeth, kind of on the alveolar ridge. Alveolar dental, that's the place where I'm making it. So you see how I haven't mentioned the tongue. I've just said it's made by putting the tongue onto the teeth in the alveolar ridge, and I call it alveolar dental. We have lips, so we get labial sounds. That was b, p. We have sounds made with the teeth, or sorry, near the teeth or the alveolar ridge. We have sounds that are made near the hard palate. So we get sounds like y, y in yellow, y. Okay, and y is a palatal. Velar sounds. Okay, so there aren't any velaric sounds that spring obviously to mind in English, but actually if you think about g and k, then I hope you can hear that they are velar, the soft palate. Your tongue is reaching up k, g, and hitting the soft palate, say k and g, and you will hear that they are velar. And there are no phonemes in English that involve the glottis, but if you say butter and water, you will hear that you have constricted the glottis. You have stopped the air from leaving by constricting the glottis. Okay. So those are the places that are relevant for describing English consonants, and there are Latin labels attached to the kind of sound that is made in those places. Now here they are. We've got bilabial, labiodental. You think about f and v, and you will see that you use your bottom lip and your upper teeth. So your bottom lip actually slides slightly behind the teeth, and you move it up, you move your jaw up, f, v. The upper teeth, of course, are passive articulators, they don't move. Dental, they involves the tongue tip and the back of the upper teeth, so we can say th and the, those are dental, okay, th and the. We can talk about alveolar sounds. If we think about t and s, can you see that your tongue is next to the alveolar ridge, s and t? So we just really have to learn these Latin labels, but you're not expected to learn them overnight. Certainly write them down. You will see them anyway on your IPA chart. They're there because this is how the consonants are classified. And when you come to the box that describes consonants, in fact, you might want to take a break, have a drink of water now, go and find your IPA chart, and you will see that down the left-hand side, you've got the places of articulation listed and they describe the consonants. And they also pattern neatly from the front of the mouth to the back of the mouth. So the ones that are at the front will come first, the bilabials will come first. As we head to the back, you will get uvular and velar sounds down the bottom of that table. So it's quite common sense, and you will eventually remember these labels, so don't worry. As we go back in the mouth then, behind the alveolar ridge, so behind this bump in the front of your mouth, we call those sounds post-alveolar. And they also called palatoalveolar because if you like, the hard palate starts there. After the alveolar ridge, we got the hard palate. Okay, so they can be called either palatal alveolar or post-alveolar. So if you think of sh for sugar, sh, or fish, the end sound in sh, I hope you can, when you make that sound, I hope you do notice that your tongue rises up and it's just hitting that place just behind the alveolar ridge. It's just on the hard palate. In contrast, y for yes in yellow is a little bit further back. So we're going further back in the mouth all the time. When we get to the soft palate, the velum, we've got things like k, g, and ng. So I don't have that phoneme because I'm a Midlander. I say sing with a g on the end as well. But anybody who's an RP speaker or a near RP speaker, or indeed anybody who's not from the West Midlands, you will have something like ng. So sing, ng. And you can hear that sound in sing is made by pushing the tongue up towards the back of the velum. Glottal sounds, glottal phonemes, h is a glottal sound. So h is quite a funny consonant really. There's not much obstruction going on, but you can hear that there is some. So that's a glottal sound. And as we've mentioned, there's the glottal allophone that we get in things like Gatwick and uh-oh and butter. Okay, so it's not actually a phoneme, but it is an allophone. It is a sound that we do hear in English. Uvular sounds we don't have in English, but anybody who speaks French will know that Central French says for rouge. And there are Northumberland dialects where older speakers will still say red and robin, yes? So we do get in some dialects. But in RP, in the model that we're going to teach you in received pronunciation, which is kind of the variety spoken in the public schools of England, often associated with the south of England, we'll come on to that. And it's frequently the accent that is taught in other parts of the world that are learning English. So, for example, Hong Kong for a long time was using RP as a model. Anybody German, you tend to be taught RP as your accent that you should copy. In RP, there is no uvula, but it's good to know that there are languages that do use this part of the vocal system, and that we can mimic those sounds. Actually, if we know where they're made, we can mimic them. Some linguists become quite good at this kind of mimicry, and there are also lovely websites that will produce the sounds for you. So there are some links to that this week in the resources. You can click on and you can hear the sound initially. So it will say ra, ara, ar, and they will make the sound for you. Now we move on to the manner of articulation. That is, how is it made? So I've already begun to talk about this because we decided that b was a bilabial stop. We've already mentioned one of these manners, the way in which the constriction happens and the degree to which it happens. That is it completely closed, the airflow? And how do we do it? Which articulators are doing it, right? Stops involve complete closure. So articulators, when we say b, the lips are stuck together, first of all. The air is completely stopped and then released. So we've got other stops. We can isolate tin, t, p, b, d. Fricatives, as the name suggests, think of friction. Fricatives involve narrowing. So the articulators come close together, but there's only a little channel. But there is still air flowing, and that causes turbulent airflow. It sounds hissy. These are hissing sort of sounds. So if you say set through this, you can hear that th, s. These are hissing sort of sounds. And I leave it to you to practice those a little bit and start to practice writing down which articulators are being used to make those. So these are fricatives. Approximants are perhaps the most vowely kind of consonants, and that is because there's a wide gap between the articulators. So there's an approximation, but there is no turbulence in the airflow. We've constricted, but not very much at all. So if we think about y and w and the r that we use in English, r. So this won't apply if any of you are Scottish, because they tend to use the trill r. But the one that we use in English, r, and w and y, we can hear that there's some space, but there's not. There's no attempt to restrict as there is with fricatives, and there's no complete closure like there is in stops. And we can arrange a hierarchy of the widest gap to the smallest gap, and we will get approximants first. There's a big wide gap. That's why they sound vowely. Fricatives, more constricted, stops, complete closure. So the following manners of articulation can be found in English. We get oral stops, so stops of the mouth like p and b. Nasal stops like So if you think about sing, I hope it's clear to you, it's the nasal passage that's being shut off. It does sound a bit nasal, doesn't it? The vowel goes a bit nasally. So sing, sing. Taps and flaps and trills. So we sometimes say, what's the matter? What's the matter? And it sounds like a duh. Actually, it's not a duh, because it's not an alveolar stop. It's a hitting the mouth and then it bounces off again. And trills, we get those in Scots English, so red and robin, okay, and indeed in Spanish, the r is trilled. So anybody who's learned Spanish knows that that's a problem for English people because they have to learn how to trill. Many languages use a trilled r. We have fricatives in English, so those hissy sounds like th and th and s and sh. We have affricates. There are only two affricates in English, and they are ch and j. So as in church and judge. They are unusual because they're two sounds essentially combined. So they are a stop followed by a fricative. And we'll come on to that in the seminars and talk about why they are a particular distinct manner of articulation. We have approximants. central approximants like y, and we have laterals, which relates to the blade of the tongue, okay? Lateral approximants, l. It's nice because it starts with a lateral approximant, actually. And you can see that there's not much closure. So in oral stops like b, what we can say is that one articulator moves against another, or two against each other in the case of the lips, to create a complete closure of the vocal tract. Okay, so the velum gets raised, so no air can leave the vocal tract, but. So your soft palate raises up, no air can come out, but you've also shut your lips. And the air from the lungs is compressed behind this constriction, this stricture. Then it's suddenly released, and we get this audible burst, and it's called plosion. There may be voicing during part of all of this, and so we return to bin versus pin, and we will find that with b there is voicing, with p there is not. And this is what a stop looks like in its phases. Okay, so the closing phase, we shut the lips, we raise the velum. There's a compression phase where we hold the air at bay, and a release phase where it bursts out. So you can see that it will burst out. If you look to the right, it's going to burst out widely and loudly. Nasal stops then, like It has the same oral cavity articulation, so there's the same obstruction in the mouth, but the difference is that the velum is lowered this time during production. Okay, while the oral closure is held, the air goes through the nasal cavity, then the oral closure is released. So this time, with n, for example, n, we've closed off the nose, and it looks like this. So you can see it looks slightly different. If you look towards the back on the right-hand side of both the figures, you can see the constriction in the left hand, but not in the right hand at the back. Taps and flaps and trills, these don't constitute phonemes in RP, so they aren't phonemes in RP, but we will come across them in American English. So if you think about pity in American English, they would say pity, okay? Butter, Spanish pero, pero, bada, da. It's different from a plosive because it's short. The tongue just hits the roof of the mouth and comes back off again. The difference with the trill is that the articulator repeatedly strikes the passive articulator. So the alveolar trill in some Scottish English varieties, yeah, red robin, yeah, perro in Spanish, contrast pero with perro, and you can hear the difference. Fricatives then, these hissy consonants, this hissing manner, the air is only escaping through a small passage. That is, there's a narrow stricture. It's constricted, but there is a narrow passage to allow air to escape, and that creates turbulence, which makes it sound hissy. And different shapes result in slightly different sounds. So contrast s with sh, s, sh, s, sh, and you will see that the tongue is doing slightly different things at the front of the mouth. I want you to think about exactly what it is doing, because we're going to discuss that in the seminar this week. What's the difference between s and sh? But this is what it looks like. So you have the closing phase, but we still have air coming through, but it's struggling to get through. It's bouncing off and bouncing back, which creates turbulence, like a turbulence in a wind tunnel. And it's going to come out in a hissy, higgledy-piggledy sort of way. As I've said, affricates are complex consonants. That's because they begin as plosives and they end up being released as a fricative. So the rule is that they must be homorganic. That means it's not as complex as it sounds. It just means that they have to be made in the same place in the mouth. Well, that makes sense because we can't really move from one place to the other producing consonants. So if you think about t and sh, they are both alveolar dental, really, t, sh, or alveolar, I suppose, post-alveolar. If you think about d and j, they really are alveolar, actually. So we can talk about this in the seminar. Sometimes they're classified as post-alveolar, sometimes alveolar, t and sh. They're made in the same place though, and it'd be very hard to move whilst making consonants. So we start with a t, complete closure, and we finish with a sh, which is a fricative. In jug, we start with a d, and we have j, so d, j. But in other languages, you can have different places of articulation. So we can have an alveolar affricate. So if you think about German 10, you have t, s, s, s. Okay, so the t is different in German 10. If you contrast church, the t in church is slightly further back than the t in sane. It's definitely dental in German, sane, but it's not in English. It's alveolar church, and that makes sense because it would have to come too far back to meet the sh in English. T sh, t s in German. T s. So affricate production looks a little bit like a hybrid between the two diagrams that I've shown you already. We get a much longer closure phrase, then we start to open the vocal tract, but there's frication this time. So we end up with the end effect is that we have a burst plus frication. Now remember we said approximants were the most vowely of all the consonants, and they involve slight narrowing of the vocal tract. There's several categories of approximants, but we tend to just distinguish between the central ones and the lateral ones. That is the ones that happen in the middle of the mouth and the ones that are caused by the tip of the tongue. That's because English really only has those two distinctions. There are languages that have different kinds of approximants we might want to talk about, but we tend to restrict our specific vocabulary depending on the language that we're examining, and we will be looking mostly at English because it's easiest for learners to concentrate on their L1 when they're learning the IPA. Now, central approximants, if you think about the R that we have in English, actually sometimes you'll see it transcribed as you would write it, but the correct symbol for the alveolar approximant R is the upside down R, this upside down back to front R. So it just makes the sound R, R, R. And you can see that the articulators come close, but they're not as close as they are for a fricative. There's much easier passage of the air. Similarly, if we say y, y, y for yes, then the tongue is raised up, but it's not actually touching the palate. Y, y, y. And if we say labiovelar approximant, so if we say w, w, we're rounding the lips, but they're not in any way obscuring the sound from coming out as they would be in b. Okay, w. So the back of the tongue is raised, but it isn't enough to block the air. And we round the lips, which directs the sound, but doesn't stop it from leaving. Lateral approximants, they involve what's called the blade of the tongue. We would call it the tip of our tongue. But in phonetics, the tongue is labelled in quite a detailed way because the tongue is such an important articulator and it's so large and it can fulfill many different roles as an articulator, so that we actually separate out the different pieces of the tongue. And I will put a diagram up of the tongue with all the parts of the tongue labelled with their labels. So if we think about l for life, then the tip of the tongue, the blade of the tongue, is on the alveolar ridge, but it's got one or both sides lowered. Try it and see what your tongue does. L. I think only one side of my tongue is lowered. It's quite individual. Try it and see what happens. And air can get around the tongue because of that. We've only put one side up, so the air is able to go around the other side. This and the r type sounds often get known as liquids, so be prepared to see that liquids means that kind of English r and l. So you will come across a reasonable amount of terminology, and we will tell you which ones are coterminous as we go through the term. If you have issues, if you come across a reading that has a piece of terminology you're not sure about, please do ask. I mean, as well as looking obviously yourselves, but do ask us to clarify, are these terms the same? Is this an umbrella term for all approximants? What does this mean? And maybe think about keeping a little glossary, because that's quite useful actually. Terminology has changed as we've got better at classifying sounds, and particularly if you read back to the 1920s and 30s, they use quite different terminology. So if you're going to look at some of the classic texts concerning phonology, like Daniel Jones, you're going to come across terms that you might not come across in the modern day. So it's good to ask us. So we can also call glides. There's a class of approximants which we call glides, and we also call them semivowels. So you might also hear them classified as semivowels. And in English, that's y and w, because they are so vowely. They're hardly consonants at all. When we say y and w, there really isn't much constriction going on at all. So have a little break and we'll talk about voicing. So we come to the last part of the classification. and it's to do with voicing. So essentially it's to do with whether the vocal cords are vibrating or whether they're wide apart and the glottis is wide open, and hence the vocal folds are not vibrating. So there's a distinction between voiced and voiceless. Although you will hear devoiced and unvoiced for voiceless as well, so look out for those. They are all synonymous: voiceless, devoiced, unvoiced. In this module, we'll be using voiceless, and you're welcome to use that. Do be consistent in the terminology you use, and do use voiceless in this particular module. So we've done this. We did this with b and d, and we can contrasted b with p, and we can contrast t and d. But it's actually easier if we use a fricative. So if we say s and z, 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 you can feel the buzzing, the hissing in z, because the vocal cords are vibrating for z. So we conclude from this that s is voiceless, and z, by contrast, is made in the same place. It's the same manner, but actually they're distinguished only by voice. So it's quite useful because it gives us a whole new set of phonemes. We can produce a whole new set of phonemes by switching on or off this vibration. It's used contrastively. It's used to produce different phonemes. So a pin is not the same thing as a bin. Sue, it might be in the zoo, but they aren't the same thing. One is a woman and one is the zoo. Tin, din, sit, sid, less, les. So z. So you can work out the phonemes from those. It's used to contrast meaning, and so we derive a whole different set of phonemes depending on whether they're voiced or voiceless. Let's think about aspiration and voiceless sounds, so breathiness and voiceless sounds. Lick your finger, put it in front of your mouth and say pin. Repeat the exercise with spin, and we can also do this in the seminar, though presumably we'll be somewhat hamstrung by our masks. So yes, in fact, do it at home where you're not going to hurt anybody. Repeat the exercise with spin. Can you feel equal amounts of cold air on your fingers for each p? Well, really, we shouldn't do, okay? There are two sorts of voiceless sounds, that aspirated and unaspirated. So pin is aspirated and unaspirated is spin. When we say a voiceless sound immediately followed by a voice sound, like a vowel, sometimes it does take a little while before the voicing is switched on. So in pin, when we say it, when we say p, the vocal folds don't start vibrating for the vowel. A little while after the lips have come apart, we switch it on, okay, the vocal folds, they don't start vibrating. That is, they stay open for a little bit after we've released the stop, and that gets a puff of air. So p should be sort of colder than sp. We can mark this aspiration with a little tiny superscript h, which shows this breathiness, it shows this aspiration. So when we transcribe pin, we would transcribe it with this little tiny superscript h. But when we transcribe spin, there would be no such aspiration. So these are called superscripts, diacritics. Diacritics are extra marks that we put on to mark phonetic information. Again, it doesn't matter if I don't aspirate pin. An English speaker would perceive it as the same phoneme, though there are languages where they are phonemic in difference, p and p. But in English, we hear it as the same. But when we're marking really detailed information, we do put these diacritics on. So we'll talk a little bit in the seminar about how to install these fonts for your computer as well, and how to start writing this, because you will be typing the IPA. And also to handwrite the IPA, because it's a good skill to be able to handwrite it clearly. So we'll practice that as well. Aspiration is not contrastive in English, but it is in Korean. That's very interesting. So pool contrasts with pool, which is grass. And I can't even mark the contrast properly because I'm not a Korean speaker. But if we have any Korean speakers or learners, perhaps you can show us. And Koreans can hear this difference. Actually, English speakers are not very attuned to this difference. Only p and t and k are ever aspirated in English, and they're only aspirated when they're the first segment in a stressed syllable. So pin and tin and king. If they follow a s, they're not. So cool versus school. You can hear the difference actually. Cool, school. There's variation across English consonants. So r, r is an alveolar approximant, and it has to be followed by a vowel in English, so it doesn't come at the end of a syllable. So we have rat. Non-rhotic dialects like English and Australian English, the r is not pronounced if there's no following vowel, so we get car. Rhotic accents like General American, which is kind of the, if you like, the dictionary, the reference accent for much of America. Scottish English, Hiberno English, so English in the Republic of Ireland, and Northern Irish English, they're all rhotic. So we get car in, if we were in Northern Ireland, we get car. In Scottish English, something like car. In General American, car. So we get r. Okay. Rhotic accents do pronounce the r after vowels. We have lost it in English. Not all English has lost it. So if we go down to Bristol, we might still find rhotic speakers. If we go up to Accrington in Lancashire, we might still find speakers who pronounce car. But it's been largely lost across England. It's restricted now really to Devon, Cornwall, Somerset, Dorset. Although it can be found among very older speakers as far as Herefordshire and even into Worcestershire. So it is still being lost. It's still in the process of being lost. But in America, that's unthinkable. And in fact, it's prestige in America. The accents that don't pronounce r, so New York, think about qua in New York English, they're marked as working class and not prestigious. So it's very interesting. Non-rhotic Englishes have linking r. So in a stream of speech where r is followed up by a word beginning with a vowel, you will have linking r. So if we say for a month, there is historically a r in for. We would, as English speakers, have said for, okay, for a month. So if I go down to Cornwall, I'll hear for a month, okay? You can hear the r, but we wouldn't say for a month. It's very, very careful RP. It's very, very careful, perceived often as very posh English to say for a month. And most of us will say for a month for ease of pronunciation. But because it's there in the spelling, because it's there etymologically, we call that linking R. Now, what we do tend to notice and judge is what we call intrusive R. That's where a r is not historically present. We also do it, non-rhotic speakers, to make it flow more easily. So if we say law and order, if you say law and order to yourself and now run it together fast, you start by saying law and order, and there's no r. But if we run it together fast, law and order, we end up with a r coming in. Even though it's not etymologically needed at all, it's from Old Norse lagu, it never had a r. There's no r in the spelling now, but we put one in for ease of pronunciation. So if we said India and Pakistan, eventually, if we said it fast enough, we'd end up with India and Pakistan. And that is sometimes judged. So in elocution lessons, they might pick that up. Teachers might pick that up if they were kind of correcting pronunciation. So the distinction between linking R and intrusive R, and we can maybe think about that in the seminars too. There is variation in consonants, so some varieties of English still have wh, okay, whales and which. Which whale am I looking at? I'm doing this in a Scottish accent, so I've kind of given away that Scotland is one of the places where that still happens. You might want to think about other people that you've heard who have wh, okay, so who would say in Wales there are lots of whales, which. And yeah, so do think about which varieties still have this contrast. What does that kind of make you think of? And it's always where the WH spelling is present. You get this upside down w phoneme, and they are phonemically, it's present. So Wales and whales, it's a phoneme in Scottish English certainly, and in some other varieties. And we've left you with two really quite easy intros. So there's Genetti, which is the course book and a really nice book. And please do read the relevant chapter on phonetics. And you can also look at Fromkin, Rodman and Hyams, which is a nice, easy intro again. And do make a note of any terminology they use that differs and anything that you're having problems with so that we can discuss it at the seminars, because that is our chance to discuss. Meanwhile, there will be some forums up for this week, and I want you to engage, please, with whatever tasks are placed on the forums. So do, as usual, go on, look at the forums, do the reading that we've asked you to do the exercises that we've asked you to prepare, and reflect and discuss on the issues that we ask you to reflect and discuss on for this week, so that we have a strong base of discussion when we come together and we meet, and so that we're not lonely, actually, because it is lonely learning on our own, and I don't want you to feel like that. So please do treat the forum as a place where you can chat and ask questions, and I'll be looking at the forum, and please do engage. Thank you for listening.